Hey guys, we are going to continue learning about factoring this week. So I'm just going to work through a couple of the problems that you're going to see in your IXL, which are really the same kind of thing that you see in that Google form. Okay. One quick note about the Google form. After you submit it, I do have it set up where you can go back and edit your responses. So if you missed a question and you want to go back and make corrections, you are welcome to go in and just do that. Okay. Um, all right, so when we are factoring trinomials that have a leading coefficient of 1, what that means is the number in front of x squared, or whatever your variable is just 1, right? So the first problem that we're going to look at is x squared plus 11x plus 10. Okay, so this is not a difference of squares, and this is not perfect squares, right? 10 is not a perfect square number, so this is not like the ones that we were looking at last week. So what we're doing is we're looking for a way that we can multiply two numbers to get 10 while those two numbers still also add to make positive 11. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a method called the X box method. We're going to start out by making an X, and then over here next to it, we are going to make a box. All right, so what we want are two numbers that are going to multiply to make 10 and add to make 11. So I'm going to put the 10 on top and the 11 on the bottom. We need to multiply to make 10 and add to make 11, right? Multiply to make this one, add to make that one. Well, when I start thinking about my numbers that multiply to make 10, my factors of 10, let me see if I can write this where y'all can see it. For factors of 10, I have 1 times 10 or 2 times 5. And that's it, right? So if I'm looking for a pair that will also add to make 11, 2 plus 5 is 7, right? So that won't work. We're going to use the 1 and the 10. So I have a positive 1 and a positive 10, right? 1 times 10 multiplies to make 10. 1 plus 10 adds to make 11. So we're going to take those two numbers that we just found, the 1 and the 10, and we're going to include those in our box. Notice that inside of this box, I've created 4 little spaces. We're going to take the first term from our problem, the x squared, and put it in the first box. The last term, the 10, goes in the last box. And the two numbers that we just found, the 1 and the 10 from over here, well, those are coming from the x. So we're going to put 1x and 10x in those boxes. Okay, now we're going to factor out the greatest common factor for each row and each column. So with the top row here, I have x squared and I have 1x. Well, they both have an x, right? So we can factor that out. And they both have a leading coefficient of 1, right? So I'm going to factor out my 1x. In the next row, these both have a 10, but they do not both have an x. So we're going to factor out a 10. I'm going to do that same process, but now I'm looking at the columns instead. So in this first column, I have x squared, and here I have 10x. Well, that means we can factor out an x and just that coefficient of 1. Here, we can't factor out an x, right? Because this one doesn't have an x. And between the number 1 and the number 10, the greatest common factor is just 1. So our factors now come from the top and the side of our box. We had across the top x and a positive 1, and across the side x and a positive 10. So our x squared plus 11x plus 10 factors to become x plus 1 times x plus 10. Now we can always double check ourselves with factoring by just foiling or double distributing our result. So this is checking our answer now, right? If this is our answer, we're going to FOIL and make sure that we do end up with the same thing that we started with. Okay, so FOIL, first times the first. X times x, that gives me x squared, right? Outside times the outside, x times 10, that's a positive 10x. Inside times the inside, 1 times x is a positive 1x. And the last times the last, 1 times 10 is a positive 10. We'll combine like terms right here, and we get x squared plus 11x plus 10, which is the same thing that we started with, right? So we know that we had the correct answer there. Okay, we're going to look at another example. Next one we're going to look at, let's do x squared plus 2x minus 3. All right, so again, right, I'm going to start out with x and the box. We want our numbers to multiply to make a negative 3 and add to make a positive 2. Okay, so when I start thinking about numbers that multiply to make negative 3, well, for negative 3, there's 1 times 3, right? And either it's negative 1 times 3 or it's 1 times negative 3. So I had negative 1 and 3 or 1 and negative 3. And that's it. Well, so if I'm looking for the pair that will combine to give me a positive 2, it's got to be the negative 1 and the positive 3, right? Negative 1 plus 3 gives me positive 2. So I'm going to put my negative 1 and my positive 3 over here on the x. And then I'm going to take my first term and put it in my first box. The last term, the negative 3, goes in the last box. And then the two pieces that we just found for the x over here, we're going to put in our box. But since they came from the x, we're going to keep an x behind them, right? Negative 1 is negative 1x. 3 is 3x. All right, and now we're going to factor each row and each column. Across the top row right here, the only thing we can take out is an x. Across the bottom row right here, we can factor out a 3. Across the first column, we have an x, and in the second column, the only thing they have in common is a 1, but since this box is negative, I'm going to make this 1 negative. Okay, anytime your number on the outside is touching a negative number on the inside, it's got to be a negative as well. All right, so this would be x minus 1 times x plus 3. Okay. All right. Let's do one more with some bigger numbers. Now we're going to look at x squared plus 20x plus 36. All right, so I'm looking for my x box. I need numbers that multiply to make 36 and add to make a positive 20. All right, so let's make a list of factors of 36. There's 1 times 36. There's 2 times 18. There's 3 times 12. 4 times 9. 5, 6 times 6. Okay, so numbers that will multiply to make 36, but add to make 20. When I start looking at my options over here, there's only one pair that adds to make 20, and it's the 2 and the 18, right? And the only way it's going to add to make 20 is if it's a positive 2 and a positive 18. Okay, so I'm going to put x squared and the positive 36 in, right? First in the first, last in the last. I'm going to take the 2 from the x and the 18 from the x and put it in the box over here. And then we're going to factor the greatest common factor. All right, so out of the first row, we can bring out an x. Out of the bottom row, we can bring out an 18. Out of the first column, we can bring out an x. And out of the second column, we can bring out a 2. So I have x plus 2 times x plus 18. All right, let's look at one that involves all negative numbers. Okay, so we're going to look at x squared minus 4x minus 5. All right, so I'm going to set up the x and I'm going to set up the box. We want numbers that will multiply to make a -5 and add to make a -4. Okay, so when I start thinking about my numbers that multiply to make -5, I could have -1 times 5, or I could have 1 times -5, and that's it. So when I start comparing these, the ones that would combine, that would add to give me a -4, well, if I do -1 plus 5, I get +4. But if I do -1 plus, or if I do 1 plus -5, I do get -4, right? So we want to use +1 and -5. Okay, now I'm going to transfer it over to the box. X squared and -5 were my first and my last. I have a +1x and a -5x. All right, so when we factoring across the top row, I have x. Factoring across the bottom row, I've got -5. Factoring in the first column, I have an x. And factoring in the second column, the only thing that they have in common is that they are divisible by 1. Okay, so notice that this is a +1 because it's not touching any negative numbers, but this was a -5 because it is touching this -5. All right, so that gives me x plus 1 times x minus 5. All right, I hope that this has been helpful to you. We will keep working on factoring through the rest of this week. On Wednesday, we will have a Zoom at 2:30. That'll be a good time for you to ask questions. Anything that you need help on, just tune in at 2:30 on Zoom. I love you guys, and I will see you later.